Okay, hello again. Welcome to your koala habitat restoration webinar. It's great to see that we have 75 people joined already, and I'm expecting a few more will continue to join as we go through these early minutes. My name is Richard Davies. I work for the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, and I'm the facilitator for today on behalf of the organisers of this webinar, and they've put together an excellent program for you. Let's start by acknowledging the people of the Bundjalung Nation, the traditional owners of the Northern Rivers. The work you're all involved in to restore koala habitat links to the ongoing culture and traditions of caring for country. We pay our respects to and give thanks to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge Aboriginal people joining the session today. The Minister for the Environment has provided some remarks to get us started. So let's hear from Minister Matt Keane.
Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd particularly like to thank the Friends of the Koala for organising this Habitat Restoration Summit and thank everyone involved in regenerating koala habitat. Your work is the difference between survival and local extinction for koalas in the Northern Rivers. We can't save the koala without your help, and make no mistake, we are at a critical junction for the survival of the koala in New South Wales. More than 25% of our koala habitat in eastern New South Wales was affected by last summer's bushfires. This is on top of the deadly threats to koalas from urban expansion and climate change, car strikes, dog attacks and disease. Future generations will never forgive us if we lose the fight to save this iconic species, which is why I set the stated goal of doubling the koala population by 2050 and why I'm determined to do whatever it takes to meet it. That includes investing $44.7 million in the koala strategy to protect and conserve koalas, with conservation of habitat at the heart of the plan. Just last month, we announced the Koala National Park in Southern Highlands, part of 3,600 hectares of priority koala habitat that were purchased for permanent protection. If we are to succeed in doubling the koala population, the support and action of local communities is going to be absolutely critical. We've got 68 on-ground actions underway to address local threats to koalas. We've distributed 60,000 koala feed tree seedlings to community groups to support habitat restoration projects. And we're working in partnership with groups like Friends of Koala, with private landowners and with local councils to ensure that conservation of important wildlife habitat happens. There is still so much we have to learn about koalas and the best way to protect them. So I'm very interested in seeing the outcomes of this summit, and I'm keen to hear your insights as to the best way we can help restore habitat in the Northern Rivers and beyond. By working together, we can protect koalas for future generations, and I wish your discussions today every possible success. And again, I'll finish where I started, with a huge thank you to everyone involved in this important project to restore koala habitat, not just in the Northern Rivers, but right across New South Wales.
I like the idea that this is can be called a summit. The summit has two parts to it. Part one is a webinar format, which we're in now. 2 hours packed full of information for practitioners, and we're very grateful to all the presenters for their input. Part two, which comes after a short lunch break, is different in that it's a Zoom meeting. It's different to a webinar because it allows you to join in the discussion, and we're going to make that manageable by using virtual breakout rooms. That second session is 1 hour duration after lunch, and it's open to all if you wish to join. Okay, so now for our current session. We have 10 short presentations, each about 7 or 8 minutes. We'll run through them in 3 batches with some time for questions and answers between each batch. As you listen, you can put your questions into a Q&A panel, which should appear in a black bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you move your mouse to the bottom of the Zoom window, there's a little line of tools. One of them is called Q&A, and you click on that and it shows a Q&A panel that you can put questions into. So we'll run 4 presentations to begin with, and then have 10 minutes worth of Q&A, where the panelists who've just spoken to you will be available for answering questions. Our first I will say that as facilitator, it's a fairly packed agenda, and so I'll try and maintain a pacey approach. And so if 10 minutes elapses for Q&A, and I'll kind of bring it to a close so that we can stay on track and hear the next presentations. Our first presentation is about koala conservation.
Good morning, everybody. It's so wonderful to see so many people joining us today that are interested in conserving koalas and their habitats in the northern part of New South Wales. So firstly, just a little bit about myself. My name's Billy Roberts. I have a background in wildlife ecology, conservation planning, and a strong interest in threatened species like koalas and flying foxes. And I've got experience here on the east coast of Australia and also in Papua New Guinea. But I'm currently working for the Department of Planning and Industry, and I'm working on local community actions to conserve the koala. So the New South Wales government is supporting a number of partnerships, and many of these are in northern part of New South Wales. But I'm also from the Northern Rivers. I live in the Clarence Valley. I've spent a lot of my life here in the Clarence. I'm the mother of 2 beautiful children, and I'm very passionate about conserving habitat and species within this region. So koalas are one of the most recognised animals across the world, and they're also an iconic symbol of Australian wildlife. But we can't forget that there's many Aboriginal cultures that have a very strong connection to koalas, and that's shown through their storylines and through their totems. And many Aboriginal cultures in the northern part of New South Wales really have strong storylines associated with the koala. If we zoom down to the Northern Rivers region and we look at the population here, we're quite lucky. It's quite a significant population. More than 1/4 of New South Wales koalas population occurs in the Northern Rivers region. And the largest population is probably the one around Lismore and West Ballina, that is estimated to be around 2,500 koalas. And what we're seeing is that this population is generally fairly stable, but we are seeing some localised decline. And habitat loss, fragmentation, urbanisation is really one of the key threats in this region. We're also seeing really significant impacts to the koala population east of the highway. We do have moderate to high levels of stress-related diseases like chlamydia in all of the koala populations in this region. And there's also quite a large or a high threat from dogs in peri-urban areas and around townships. But 2 things that are quite important is that this region has an overall low to moderate threat from future climatic changes compared to other locations where koalas are found. And if we look at the impact of the recent bushfires, and that's what that map is showing in the northern part of New South Wales, and I've just highlighted roughly the Northern Rivers region. Those yellow areas are areas of significant koala populations, and what's in red is some of the recent bushfires. And you'll see to the north, large areas there were unaffected by these recent fires. But we are seeing towards the southern part of that square that there was large areas of national park and state forest that were impacted. So the New South Wales government has quite an ambitious goal to secure the koala in the wild for the next 100 years. And more recently, the New South Wales Environment Minister has made another sort of ambitious commitment that not only does he want to see them secured, but he'd like to see their population doubling by 2050. So how are we going to achieve these ambitious goals in the Northern Rivers region? And really, I think the key is to be securing habitat for koalas throughout this region, because, of course, without the habitat, we're not going to see koalas survive. But it is more about just putting trees in the ground. It's about providing koala habitat that's in the right locations. It's about planting the right trees, and it's about managing some of those other threats that we have to koalas in the region. But with the limited capacity and resources that we have, the only way that we're going to be able to secure that habitat, government can't do it alone. It really is about the people that occur here and establishing local partnerships. But what's so unique about the Northern Rivers region is that already is so many great partnerships that already exist here. There's also an amazing amount of restoration knowledge, and we're going to hear from some experts today. But it's the enthusiasm for koala conservation that is really unique to other areas of New South Wales. And what we're seeing in that survey that was circulated to everyone is that practitioners are really wanting to have a bit more of a coordinated approach in the area, and they want to see better recording of these projects. But everybody is in agreement that it's about working together, ensuring that we're collaborating well, that we're sharing knowledge. That's the best way that we're going to secure koala populations in the region. I just wanted to quickly talk about the New South Wales Government is supporting a number of these partnerships in the Northern Rivers region. This is just a little snapshot that will soon be published in an annual report for the New South Wales Koala Strategy. But we're looking at habitat restoration projects with a number of partners and replanting habitat in some key locations. So around Lismore, Manautri, Clunes, Rose Bay. We also have some restoration projects in the Clarence Valley. We've also been funding the Tweed City Council to look at how we can actually change owner behaviour when it comes to domestic dog attack on koalas. And also of significance is that we're supporting about 6 Aboriginal ranger groups throughout the Northern Rivers who are already doing some amazing work in conserving and restoring koala habitat. And one of the projects, Chelsea Marshall, we're going to hear from her later today. Also, another project last financial year is that we helped to supply 50,000 koala food trees to many of our partners through the Northern Rivers region. Of note, only yesterday, the koala habitat revegetation guidelines were finally launched. These guidelines were written by Greening Australia, but they were also reviewed by about 27 restoration experts. And associated with those guidelines, at the same time, we've released 2 other guidelines. One of them is about mitigating vehicle strike and what are the best practice methods for mitigating that. And also another community engagement guide about how we can protect wildlife from domestic dogs. And if you're interested in reading any of those guidelines, jump onto our community website. This was launched about 12 months ago, koala.newsouthwales.gov.au, but there's lots of different resources and there'll be links to where you can get those guidelines. So I really just wanted to wrap up and say, really our vision for the future needs to be even greater collaboration between our partners than what we're seeing now. It would be wonderful if we have one strategic goal that all of us are working towards across the Northern Rivers. It'd be wonderful if we had developed a regional integrated strategy that really prioritises what are the right partnerships and what are the right locations for koala restoration, and really having a spatial recording of all of these restoration efforts in one spot. And hopefully, as a result of these actions, we'll see the koala populations thriving and hopefully even doubling in size in the near future. Thank you and enjoy the webinar today.
Thanks, Billy. You emphasised a large and committed and expert community of practitioners all working together, and we've now reached over 100 people have joined this webinar. Around about 150 people registered, and for those who are unable to make it, the webinar is being recorded, so will exist as a resource for people to access. Keep an eye on the Q&A panel. I'll have a quick look there. No questions there yet, but you're welcome, if questions occur to you for the panelists, to enter them in the Q&A panel. And you can check on the questions that are there and use a thumbs up button to vote questions up the list. I'll generally ask the questions that are at the top of the list. Our next presentation is about what to plant where.
Hello everyone, I'm John Callaghan. I'm a koala ecologist, and my talk is about a regional koala assessment undertaken recently as part of an ARC linkage project led by Professor Clive McAlpine at the University of Queensland. The project was undertaken in partnership with Lismore, Ballina, Byron and Tweed councils and in collaboration with Friends of the Koala, Southern Cross University and New South Wales DPIE. The project involved a regional assessment of koala distribution and habitat use aimed to help guide strategic planning across the councils that form the Far North Coast region. The project outcomes are intended to assist integrated regional planning by helping to prioritise areas for koala habitat protection and restoration efforts. This includes identifying key factors that appear to influence habitat use by koalas and that combine to contribute towards population persistence. For the ecological conceptual model, we sought to investigate potential variables that might best explain the distribution and activity of koalas at scales ranging from individual trees to sites and then up to landscapes. The region was firstly divided into 160 landscapes by overlaying a 5 by 5 kilometre grid. Each landscape represented a mosaic of different land uses, forest covers, soil nutrients, vegetation communities, moisture availabilities, and road densities. The landscapes were then categorised into 5 groupings based on the extent of potential koala habitat, that is, communities containing eucalypts, angophoras, corymbias, lophostomans, or melaleucas. A representative subset of landscapes was then selected for conducting field surveys based on the extent and the patchiness of potential koala habitat within each of the LGAs. For the ecological conceptual model, Figure B shows the 5 by 5 kilometre grid over the study region. Figure C depicts a survey site within a landscape where potential explanatory variables have been measured, such as the proportion of suitable habitat, patch size and connectivity, patch composition, distance to waterways, and distance to roads. At the site scale, Figure D, we surveyed the nearest 30 trees for koala fecal pellet evidence, and we recorded soil properties, elevation, slope, and aspect. At the individual tree scale, we recorded the tree species and measured the size and assessed condition and evidence of koala use. The field surveys involved application of the spot assessment technique at a target of 6 independent sites within each of the landscapes. Sites were randomly selected based on relevant criteria using the GIS, and coordinates were uploaded into handheld GPS units to navigate to the sites in the field. Councils helped with the process of contacting landowners to seek permission for access onto private properties. And sites ranged from heavily forested and steep terrain in rural areas to council parks and road reserves in the peri-urban landscape, all in search of the very elusive koala fecal pellets. The survey results allowed for sites to be rated according to activity levels, that is, the proportion of trees that had evidence of use across the region. This helps to identify high and low use koala areas that can be then interpreted in conjunction with analysis of siting records and ecological history data. A very important outcome from the surveys is the ability to establish proportional use of tree species by koalas and to rank species in order of their importance for koalas across the region. From the figure, you can see that a group of around 5 main eucalypt species and 2 main non-eucalypt species stood out from the rest in terms of their importance and use by koalas. We also looked at the importance of tree size compared to availability. This confirmed that trees of all sizes are indeed regularly used by koalas, but particularly the larger categories of trees in the case of the preferred eucalypt species. Now, in terms of how this regional information can guide habitat restoration, key points are the councils will have a habitat model or map, as you can see on the right of the screen, to help locate priority areas for protection and restoration, the identified preferred food and shelter tree species can guide the selection of sites for restoration efforts. The preferred eucalypt species have greatest influence on where koalas occur within the region, and where the preferred tree species occur, there is a positive effect statistically on the use of other tree species by koalas. Hence, this goes to the crucial importance of the aim to restore vegetation communities with original species composition and structure. Given that the research has confirmed that koalas use a very wide range of tree species of all size classes, it is crucial to aim to restore original ecosystem types rather than simply focusing on the most preferred eucalypt food tree species. And finally, thanks for your time, and we'd like to acknowledge all of the key partners in this project. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. I think we all want our restoration to be as effective as possible, and this kind of scientific research provides the information needed to make sure that we configure our work appropriately. Just a reminder that if you have questions occur to you as you listen to the presentations, you can use the Q&A pod, and then the panelists are online at the end of the fourth of these first four presentations for about a 10-minute Q&A session before we move on to some more presentations. Our next presentation discusses taking a regional approach.
Hi, my name's Scott Hetherington. I work for Tweed Council and this in the role of Senior Program Leader Biodiversity. And my background is in wildlife conservation and management across Queensland and New South Wales, and fortunately have had the pleasure of being involved in working in particular in the Tweed and the Tweed Coast endangered koala population for the last 7 years. I'm here to discuss plans afoot to develop a regional koala conservation strategy. It's really important for koala habitat restoration because we have a lot of proven success with koalas using planted habitat in our region, with working together and with engaging landholders. We have a lot to learn around planting to accommodate our management of fire, to creating open forest, around community engagement and behaviour change, and also around prioritising investment. We have a lot to share as well, lots of lessons, lots of expertise, lots of outcomes, resources and ideas. It's certainly somewhat coincidental, but there's no doubt that it's exactly the right time to get a regional koala conservation strategy together. The New South Wales Koala Strategy is currently under review. We've got a recent commitment by the New South Wales Minister, Environment Minister, for an extra 20,000 koalas, and completion of the initial 5 years of saving our species. Right now also presents the ideal opportunity to reflect on and document some of the outcomes of our existing successful collaborations over an extended period that demonstrate the benefits of our regional approach and our capacity to deliver highly significant outcomes. Projects and programs such as Tweed Byron Koala Connections, the Regional Koala Communications Group, koala rescue and rehabilitation throughout the region, and the North East Hinterland Koala Conservation and Recovery Project make it abundantly clear that we are delivering already an integrated and effective body of work. Numerous other factors, such as having now some baseline koala activity data for our region from prior to the 2019-20 fires, being part of the Northern Rivers Joint Organisation, and being involved in several regional scale research projects, together with an abundance of local initiatives that for all further highlight the opportunity to taking a regional approach. Within the regions, councils have established KPOMs for priority areas, which have a relationship back to the New South Wales state planning policy and are delivering integrated recovery and conservation action. Things such as habitat protection, threat management actions for dogs, fire and vehicles, long-term standardised monitoring, and innovative approaches and solutions. The development and implementation of these plans in conjunction with key groups such as Friends of the Koala, major long-term investment by the council of at least $2.5 million over the last 10 years, funding support from Environment Trust and Saving Our Species have all also contributed to the engagement of an active and supportive community and a highly skilled and experienced team. I've surely missed a few contributing projects, individuals and organisations, but the key thing for today is just to recognise the amazing work to date and how this really demonstrates our capacity and the opportunity that the current situation provides. We're now also able to add in some new and useful science. The ARC Linkage grant-funded project conserving and restoring koala populations in the New South Wales far north coast provides analysis of social barriers and opportunities for conservation, provides a regional koala activity assessment, an investigation of the relative importance of these factors and how they drive koala habitat use in the region. During this forum, John Callaghan will share more detail on the outcomes of the koala activity assessment, and Georgina Jones is speaking to the direct application of this information through the North East Hinterland project, which has already resulted in more than 300 hectares of conservation agreements in those areas that have been identified as of the highest regional koala significance through this work. Other outcomes and data has been published, and all the papers are in prep. And so the proposed regional strategy will be based on this information, together with the skills and the knowledge of the practitioners who are delivering these actions. The picture starts to look a little like this. There's a couple more elements to consider there in terms of that overall regional approach. Things such as environmental zones and how they inform local environmental plans, the draft New South Wales koala monitoring strategy, and the opportunity to identify and prioritise management actions for known and potential issues and issues that emerge. The regional strategy is proposed to assist us to achieve this outcome by using this new science and analysis to guide our conservation recovery. We intend that it will complement and improve outcomes for local, regional, state and federal programs, identify and address gaps, to include our ongoing 3-yearly monitoring, and to be a model for the use for koalas throughout their range. We're currently preparing and sharing funding proposals to have the project funded through DPIE, Saving Our Species, and ultimately we will go directly to Minister Keane in relation to his commitment. So working regionally is the most useful and effective scale to achieve koala recovery. It matches the scale at which key threats operate. It involves individuals and organisations who are already working together on multiple issues. And it saves time and money through sharing information and resources. It also importantly reminds us that our political boundaries are of no relevance to our critical task of saving the koalas of our region.
Thanks, Scott. Emphasising how a regional approach embraces the importance of an integrated and joined up effort, which is echoed in the whole sentiment of today of coming together from wherever you are to see opportunities to cooperate. Okay, there are a couple of questions in the question pod. A reminder that you can ask them there. At the end of the next presentation, we're going to switch to a Q&A session. If you see a question there that you like, use the thumbs up button, as some of you have already been doing, to kind of vote that question up the list, and it will be asked sooner. The final presentation of this first little batch of 4 is on private land conservation.
Hi, my name's Georgina Jones. I'm talking to you today about the North East Hinterland Koala Conservation and Recovery Project, and in particular private land conservation agreements. I've been involved in land care and ecological restoration and environmental education for over 18 years. And I work for an organisation called Invite Environment. That's a not-for-profit community organisation that's based in the region for over 25 years, delivering projects to engage public and private land managers in ecological services across a range of New South Wales North Coast ecosystems. Even before the devastating impact of bushfires, as we know, a New South Wales parliamentary inquiry found that koalas are on track to become extinct in the wild in New South Wales well before 2050, without urgent intervention to stop the habitat destruction. koala populations in the northern New South Wales local government areas of Tweed, Byron and Ballina Shire Council and Lismore City Council are declining due to multiple impacting threats. These local councils, alongside Friends of the Koalas, have a long history of successful collaboration with regard to koala conservation. Saving Our Species has established a major partnership in the Northern Rivers, the North East Hinterland Koala Conservation and Recovery Project, to assist in the recovery of the North East Hinterland koala populations. Saving Our Species is providing funding over 3 years to support this project, which also includes funding a dedicated koala conservation officer 2 days a week. My role is to provide this koala project officer service across the 4 LGA areas in the Tweed, Lismore, Byron and Ballina local government areas. I also work closely with Friends of the Koala, the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, other interested stakeholders and private landholders. The Australian Research Council provided funding for an arc linkage project, conservation and recovering the koala populations on the New South Wales Path North Coast, which has identified areas of highest regional priority for koala habitat suitability and activity across these 4 local government areas. My primary role is to identify, negotiate and secure a minimum of 16 conservation agreements through the Biodiversity Conservation Trust's Conservation Partners Program in these areas that have been identified by the ARC Linkage Project. The New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust provides funding for private land conservation when property owners enter into perpetual conservation agreements. They're permanent agreements that protect special areas of native bushland on private land. Parameters for conservation agreements clarified by the BCT for koala habitat in my project considered any site meeting the following criteria. Was any area over 20 hectares with vegetation in moderate to good condition, and any site that has the same conservation value as meets the criteria for a funded agreement. But in Lismore and Ballina, that was koala habitat over 4 hectares, including more than 2 hectares of existing occupied habitat, which opens the door for small land parcels that support good koala habitat to be protected. Properties that fell into these ARC linkage priority areas that met the BCT criteria for conservation agreements are currently being identified. Working in consultation with the local councils and the BCT, these eligible properties have received information about the North East Hinterland Koala Conservation and Recovery Project and the Conservation Partners Program. This is some of the mapping that has informed priority areas that I've been targeting in the Tweed and south of Lismore in the Rutherford and Tucky area. This has also occurred in Ballina and Byron Shire areas as well. So during the first year of the project, there's been 12 landowners that have expressed interest into entering into conservation agreements. 9 have already submitted BCT landowner interest forms and have been approved to proceed to the next stage of site assessments, which informs the development of the conservation agreement and a site values report. Landowner agreements in progress are potentially securing up to 318 hectares in these areas identified as highest regional priority for koalas. Other strengths include the collaboration, support, cooperation and enthusiasm amongst all the stakeholders for this project, and particularly the enthusiasm for the landowners we're working with, for the ability to assist them and their aspirations and goals to protect habitat for koalas and other threatened species on their properties. One of the challenges is some of the eligible private landholders that have been approached about the project are committed to protecting koala habitat while managing their land for other uses such as farming. In many cases, the Biodiversity Conservation Trust will work with these eligible landholders to maximise their options for diverse income while protect koala habitat on their land and do allow grazing for some of their funded agreements. But this requires yearly monitoring and reporting and condition thresholds to maintain. Unfortunately, through the Conservation Partners Program, this level of monitoring currently is not realistic for an unfunded agreement and can be cost prohibitive to the land manager. We're keen to work with our partners under this program to see if we can address some of these issues to ensure that we can and we are able to protect important koala habitat while farmers manage their land for other uses such as cropping and grazing. In conclusion, supporting and encouraging land managers to protect koala habitat on private and public land is crucial to build the resilience of koala populations in New South Wales. Protecting and enhancing already established koala habitat provides an immediate and cost-effective outcome for koala conservation, which also benefits the conservation of many other locally occurring species, including threatened gliders, owls and other important flora, species and communities. This project is making a positive difference to protect not only important koala habitat, it provides an integrated approach across the North Coast LGAs, incorporating the most cost-effective, up-to-date science and expertise to assist to conserve and recover koala populations into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgina. It's so interesting to see an evidence basis for prioritising areas and then, as you say, to involve this cost-effective part of koala conservation, private land conservation. Thanks to all of the presenters. They were given a very beautiful constraint of keeping it to about 7 or 8 minutes and did really well to convey the guts of their big body of work in each case. We have a little poll question for you to respond to now. So it should have appeared on your screen and you can just click and then submit your response to the question, and then we'll see what more than 100 people on the call now have to say in response to that. And while you're doing that, I can see there are questions now in the question pod, so I'm going to invite the presenters to open their cameras and microphones. And I'll get ready to ask the first question. You may have noticed some questions are answered directly, and then that changes their status in the list. That's when that question is much more able to be answered with a sort of single answer. But mostly we will try to ask your questions to a panel of presenters. So I'll allow you to finish answering that poll, and then we will, well, as we do that, the results will appear on screen, but I might take that first question, and it is addressed initially to John. Let me just check I am looking at the first one. Yes. John, could you please expand on the findings of the use of other species being influenced by the presence of the preferred koala food trees? Does that mean that if food trees are present, then koalas will use these and a variety of other trees as well? Is greater diversity of trees in a site better as a koala habitat?
Thanks, Richard. Yes, indeed. That, in a nutshell, that is what that means. So, where it confirms that the preferred eucalypt species are the drivers of the core areas supporting koalas within the study region. That's not unexpected. However, what we also found is that there's a clear positive effect on the use of other tree species that occur in conjunction with those preferred food tree species as well. So if we are looking at regional ecosystem types vegetation communities, for example, that contain other tree species but not the preferred ones, so other eucalypts and non-eucalypts, but not in that sort of preferred group of 5 eucalypts, then there'll be a certain level of use, and by use I'm talking about the proportions of trees that we survey that have koala fecal pellet evidence associated with them. So the proportions of those trees, you know, there may well be some evidence of koala use. Typically that would be comparatively low when you compare that to sites that have the preferred food tree species occurring. And it need not be high densities of the preferred tree species. It might just be a low density of particularly larger specimens of the preferred food tree species that are healthy in those cases, then we can see that the strike rates, the proportional use rates of the other tree species are elevated significantly above what they would be if those species are occurring on their own without the preferred tree species. So again, just indicating that the preferred tree species are the key, but that those tree species on their own don't provide all of the habitat requirements for koalas, that where they occur, that the koalas will rely on a whole range of other tree species that are present there. And sometimes it might well not be just for supplementary food. It may well be for shelter and thermoregulation. We know that mums with advanced back young will often be sort of down lower in some of the smaller understory type trees rather than sort of high up in the canopy when the young are just starting to explore. Great for keeping out of the sun during really hot conditions and perhaps avoiding aerial predators. So a range of other species are indeed very important.
Okay, great, thanks. And I'll just follow up with this one. Can you also elaborate on the influence of underlying geology and soil type on the occurrence and habitat use by koalas?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and we're still undertaking some analysis on that front. When we undertook our surveys at each of our survey sites within each of the landscapes in the field, we took a soil sample, but we only had a small sort of instrument with us to collect the sample from probably 10 centimetres or so below the surface, so it wasn't a deep soil sample. When we had those samples analysed by the lab at Southern Cross Uni, the results told us the levels of some of the key nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, ammonium. So we were able to sort of build those results into our statistical models, and Jonathan Rhodes at UQ has been helping us to undertake that. And the outcomes of those models show that there is a weak effect, a weak positive effect of some of the key soil nutrients on increasing the level of use that we're recording in the field by koalas of trees. So that's not surprising. If we had been able to take sort of deeper soil samples in the field, then that may have sort of given us a stronger positive effect. We know from our own kind of field observations that there are some areas that have, for example, that are based on volcanic basalt-derived geologies and Krasnozem soils, and those areas are key, and they certainly support some of the highest densities of koala populations in the study region, as well as those sort of right down on the floodplain where there's deep sort of alluvial soils as well. So we know soils have a significant impact at a kind of a micro scale across sort of all of the region. Then it's probably not quite as profound as what we were anticipating. So obviously there are other variables that are perhaps more important, or at least equally important as soils.
Yeah, okay, you can see there's a real appetite to be well informed technically to do the right thing in restoration, so that's great. Thank you. I thought I just saw a question that I now don't see, so I'll ask the next one. While the work being done in the 4 Far North Coast Council areas sounds great, in the Clarence Valley Council area, we don't have any support from our local member, Chris Kaluptis, and a questionable real support for our local government, from our local government. Any advice on how we can raise the support of the state and local government to strongly support the work of our local partners? I wonder if that revolves around Scott's experience producing the strategy in his area.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks, Peter, for the question. There's no doubt it's a long-term investment to get that, and I think that we've certainly started from a local government perspective by working closely with our councillors and with our partners, and we have a very strong message from the community that it's an important issue. They make that clear through their representations to their local government representatives. They make that clear through their voting. we then are able to, to work with that community support and, to get these kind of regional collaborations underway, and also to demonstrate to the state government and particular, organisations like Saving Our Species that we can deliver really important and successful outcomes. So, there are certainly some quite, interesting and at the moment even bizarre vagaries around how you might get support from the state government. But I think, starting locally and demonstrating what you can achieve through action is the way to build it over time.
Okay, thanks. Okay, the next question I can see is, what can we do to get the EPA or a private company to survey for koalas in Myrtle State Forest near Casino in Richmond, Clarence Valley? Working with Dale and Pugh from NEFA and citizen scientists, we've conducted koala scat surveys on 2 occasions and have found evidence of high-use koala trees. Myrtle Forest was due to be logged by Forestry Corp on the 24th in 2020, but due to our intervention, the logging is on hold. So it's about arguments to ensure a survey is undertaken. Who'd like to have a swing at that one?
Someone for you, Billy.
We can have a look into that. There's been some recent surveys that have been done, but I can get back to, I can look into that and get back to him.
Okay, thanks. All right, well, we're moving just on time, and I did warn that the 10 minutes for Q&A was not abundant, but overall in the design of the 2 sessions, there's in total 3 hours of webinar and then discussion sessions. About 50% of it is available for a bit of interaction. So thanks, keep your questions coming. And we're going to hear 3 more presentations now. And then at the end of those 3, there will be more time for Q&A, and maybe some of the content of these 3 begins to answer questions that we didn't publicly answer as well. So I will begin by inviting the next presentation, Growing and Maintaining Forests.
So hello everyone, my name's Justin Black and I work for Forestry. And today I'll be talking about growing and maintaining forests and some of the work that we're doing supporting community-led koala habitat restoration. So a little bit about who we are. I'm sure you've heard all about our timber harvesting, but that's a small part of what we do. We've been around for over 100 years managing New South Wales forests, and we manage these forests for multiple objectives, including conservation, recreation, growing trees and harvesting trees. The timber part is important as we grow and produce a local product that is one of the only building materials that supports efforts to combat climate change. And if you want to learn a little bit more about that, go to Planet Ark's website. We employ a team of specialists to manage these forests, including foresters, ecologists, and technical specialists. And really, we are specialists in growing and managing forests, which obviously is pretty important to koalas. One way that we're supporting koala habitat restoration is through our tree donation program. This program has been growing over the years. Initially, we were distributing seedlings to community in an ad hoc way, and we formalised this with the Port Macquarie Koala Hospital in 2018. Since then, it's grown, and we're now supporting the Koala Hospital, the Friends of the Koalas, and Bangalow Koalas with around 50,000 seedlings we're donating this year for them to distribute through their networks to the community. One reason that we can do this is because we grow millions of seedlings each year at our Grafton nursery. So this is our nursery at Trenair in Grafton. It supports our plantation establishment program, and we're growing around 4 million seedlings per year for these plantations. We've been growing seedlings for quite a while now, over 60 years, and we have this down to an art. You can see from the photos that there's a great bunch of people that work there, and Kath French, who's the nursery manager, she's there on the right. She's very knowledgeable and she's always there willing to help. So our tree donation program, it's part of a larger program we have working with fauna care groups across the state. A couple of things we're doing at the moment includes our nest box program after this year's fires. We do provide forest and plantation management advice to wildlife groups that are growing trees. And one thing we've done recently is we've been training wildlife carers in fire awareness so that they can go into fire grounds and help support injured animals. Finally, a quick plug for our Community Timber Partnerships program. We have a lot of sawn timber that was water damaged that we're providing to community groups across the state. And it's ideal for enclosures and nest boxes. And if you're interested as a community group, come and talk to me. So one thing that we noticed when we started our tree donation program was that there was little publicly available information for landholders about how to plan and plant the koalas. So we put together these information sheets to go out with the seedlings that we're donating. One of the sheets gives really good information about how to be successful in planting your seedlings, and the other provides advice on planning to enhance koala habitat. If you're going to go to the effort to plant, you want to make sure that you're successful, and planning helps you get the right tree in the right place. So there is an art to growing forests on cleared land, and we've got a fair bit of experience with all the hardwood plantations that we've been establishing over the years. I think that it's important to understand the growth habits of eucalypts, and I thought I'd share a couple of things to get you all thinking. The first point is that it's critical to control weeds and grasses around young trees. This is why we plant the trees close together, so that when the canopies touch, they start shading out the grasses and the weeds. And what that means is that we don't have to do as much chemical or mechanical weed control. And that weed control is critical to the tree's growth. And if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, I put that in to show how to tell whether a young tree is healthy or not. And if you look at the picture on the left, you can see that tree is very pointy. It's got a strong apical dominance, and that indicates that it's growing really well. So that's something to look out for. So if you're managing a forest, you want to make sure that it's healthy. And one thing that we're interested in is how forests that have been getting sick because of a reduction in prescribed fire. I'll put to you that human fire maintains the balance of nature, and that frequent mild burning maintains healthy forests. We know that young trees grow well without fire, but once trees get over the age of around 20, prescribed burning helps maintain that forest health, as well as reducing the impact of wildfires with the reduced fuel loads. Going forward, I think it's really important that we understand that prescribed burning supports healthy forests and therefore supports healthy koala populations. Just to finish off, I thought I'd talk to you about the current research that we're doing on koalas. We have a monitoring project at the moment with DPI and the Port Macquarie Koala Hospital, looking at how koalas respond to areas that we've harvested. We are learning a fair bit about as a result of this project. And we're learning about how koalas use different areas. For example, during the summer when it's hot, we're learning about how they use ridges as well as gullies to stay cool, depending on what the weather's like. As we learn more, we'll be sharing this information to help us all understand the management of koala habitat. So that's it from me. We are here to help, and hopefully I've shared that we know a little bit about growing trees and managing forests. Get in contact with me if there's anything you want to follow up on, and good luck with your tree growing.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, a mountain of experience growing trees for sure. I wasn't aware of the activities that support habitat restoration. And I love the idea that when canopies touch, grasses and other weeds are better controlled just by that competition and shading effect. It's an important idea. Okay, our next presentation is on restoration ecology. Apologies for the pause. Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this forum. I've worked as a bush regenerator and then qualified as a restoration ecologist working with our company Bushland Restoration Services over the past 20 years. In relation to koala habitat restoration, I have concentrated on applying best practice methods to restore existing habitat and revegetate cleared gaps and corridors to create koala habitat. A long-term involvement in koala-related activities, including radio tracking, rescue and care, has provided a knowledge of the habits and habitat preferences of koalas. An understanding of restoration ecology is the basis of restoring or creating koala habitat. Koala habitat restoration is often thought of as planting koala primary food trees, whereas a practical knowledge of restoration ecology will guide the selection of the appropriate approach to be used. As the target is to provide habitat for koalas, a knowledge of the site in the landscape is required. Ask yourself or seek advice on whether the project will restore or extend on existing known koala habitat, or maybe provide new habitat by planting to fill a gap or connect two areas of existing habitat. The larger the area of native vegetation, the more viable it will be to support a population of koalas. Before starting, decide what the project will achieve. Is it practical, and is there the capacity to achieve the goal? Will the end result be a self-sustaining ecosystem and provide habitat for koalas and other species, and in what time frame? Start with an assessment of the site, recording attributes such as previous land use, access, soil type, slope, native and weed vegetation present. Then decide which approach to take. The site may just need control of the weeds and fencing from stock, therefore would rely on natural regeneration, or it may be highly degraded ex-banana land and require a reconstruction approach. The site shown is ex-banana land, steep with degraded soils and no access to water. There is a strip of retained vegetation in the north and forest to the east and south. The vegetation to the east provided the reference community for plant selection for the establishment of koala habitat. The retained strip of vegetation along the north includes large forest red gum, with the selected approach being assisted natural regeneration, not requiring planting. A reconstruction approach was selected for the cleared area. The central photograph shows the same view of the planting after 8 years, with established trees, sparse weed, natural regeneration and developing structure. This site has been regularly used by koalas from around year 2 after planting. The right-hand photograph also shows a view to the planting with the existing forest in the background. In time, the goal is for the two to blend together, making it difficult to decipher where the planting ends and the natural forest begins. The linking of the east and west native forest will provide continuous habitat for koalas and other fauna. Results of a later planting, several kilometres to the west, show a comparison between a 6-year-old planting on ex-banana land and adjacent, more advanced regrowth forest. The planting was very challenging due to difficult access, poor soil, steepness of the site and dense cover of molasses grass. This planting provided the opportunity to improve on the 2012 planting, with the first change to include a more diverse range of species. The primary food trees included the 4 species local to Tweed Shire, and the additional trees included 8 sclerophyll species and 7 rainforest species for planting in the gullies. The results have shown that the plants did survive and trees have flourished and flowered. Weeds have not recolonised the site, and there is regular use by koalas. No formal data collection has been undertaken, and these results have been recorded by observation. The site had 11 photo points set up throughout prior to commencement. The comparison photographs showed the growth and survival of the plants over the 3 years. After the 3 years, the photographs were obscured by trees. The results are pleasing, but the presence of ground cover clumps of native grasses or shrubs would have been a highlight. What has been successful in these projects has been the benefit of thorough site preparation and then maintenance over a period of 5 years or longer. Eliminating the dense weed cover prior to planting and then ongoing follow-up has significantly reduced the weed competition, providing the plants the opportunity to access the limited resources, resulting in high survival and growth of the plants and provision of space for natural regeneration. The selection of koala secondary food and habitat trees was increased in the more recent 2014 project to reflect the species composition of the nearby reference community. After 6 years, the site has many of the attributes of a natural forest, which provides food and shelter for koalas. There is a mix of species, development of structure and function, natural recruitment, and use of the habitat by koalas and a range of other species. A change that could improve the outcome is the selection of the primary koala food trees to be restricted to the species occurring in the reference community and the exclusion of rainforest species. At both sites, there was natural regeneration, including native ground covers, but generally less than would be expected over the 6 and 8 year periods. A third site, planted on flat lower-lying land, recorded higher natural regeneration and a diversity of native ground covers after 2 years. A final recommendation would be to monitor the changes over time, including planted species that showed best survival and growth rate, time of flowering, natural regeneration of trees, shrubs and ground covers, and use of the site by the target species, koalas, and other non-target species. This would require a basic template that could be used by practitioners and included in reporting at set intervals over time. The challenge is out there to strive for a higher standard of koala habitat restoration. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhonda. I love the discipline of restoration ecology and that commitment to the long term, to monitoring and to learning from what you observe and adapting accordingly. The next presentation relates to it by focusing on ecosystem function.
The focus of my talk today is koala habitat restoration. Are we restoring ecosystem function or accelerating its demise? The Northern Rivers restoration industry leads the world in the restoration of rainforests, and over the last decade has begun expanding into the open forest which koalas rely on for habitat. However, with industry training and experience almost exclusively focused on rainforest restoration, there is concern that repurposing of our trusted rainforest restoration methods may fail to restore functional, self-sustaining open forests. Open forests and rainforests, or closed forests, function in opposing ways. Open forests are defined by their open canopy and a high light environment, allowing development of a dense flammable ground layer which supports regular fire and which in turn maintains the open canopy. However, closed forests have a closed canopy and the dense shade suppresses the flammable ground layer, which helps keep fire out and the canopy closed. However, in the Northern Rivers region, regular fire has become rare in most open forest areas, leading to canopy closure by rainforest pioneers and weeds and threatening to displace koala habitat with closed forest. The demise of fire in the region is illustrated by a recent study in Byron Shire, where we found that only 10% of open forest and heathland is within threshold for the maintenance of biodiversity, and that 61% is overdue for fire. The study also found that around 90% of primary coastal koala habitat is overdue for fire. In the absence of fire, rainforest invasion is rapid and widespread. In the 1990s, Byron Shire had nearly 3,000 hectares of dry open forest, which by definition has no rainforest plants in the understory. By 2016, only 16% remained, with rainforest mid-story invasion prompting more than 2/3 to be remapped as wet open forest and 15% as full rainforest. A dense rainforest mid-story prevents koala trees from regenerating. Koala feed trees typically regenerate after fire because they require bare ground and high light levels to germinate and grow, but it's simply too dark under a dense rainforest mid-story. Secondly, a dense rainforest mid-story can also lead to the premature dieback of koala feed trees by outcompeting the eucalypts for water, nutrients and light, creating unfavourable soil conditions, and rainforest invasion primes open forest for bell miner associated dieback, with the rainforest understory providing the ideal nesting habitat for bell miner colony establishment. Beyond the threats to koalas, a range of open forest species also sharply decline as rainforest pioneers invade open forests. Working with Joe Green from Byron Council, we assessed 13 dry open floodplain forest restoration sites. The review sought to determine whether restoration works were restoring an open canopy, restoring an open forest ground layer, and restoring the ecological function of open forests. The key principles of the national standards for ecological restoration in Australia are firstly that restoration should be based on an appropriate reference ecosystem with historical structure, composition and function, and secondly that these reference ecosystem attributes should provide the basis for restoration targets on your restoration site. For our assessment, we built a reference model for dry open forests from the literature, and we also measured 12 sites from reference old growth dry open floodplain forests in the Bundjalung Wilderness area. So was an open canopy restored on the Byron sites? The green band shows the canopy closure range for the old growth reference sites. For the restoration sites, the canopy closure was beyond or at the limit of reference conditions for all regeneration sites shown in blue and for all plantings once they reached 4 years of age. Another measure of canopy closure is leaf area index. All regeneration sites except one and planting sites at 5 years were found to be beyond the tolerance of open forest grasses. The high cover was mostly due to dense rainforest saplings stimulated by primary weed control on regeneration sites and the close spacing and high proportions of rainforest trees used in open forest plantings. Mean tree spacings in reference open forest was around 10 metres, while planting spacings were much closer with a mean of around 2.5 metres. And what about open forest ground cover? Mean ground cover in reference open forest was between 21 and 42%, while restoration site ground cover was below 10% on all but one site. And thirdly, are we restoring ecological function? All restoration sites were found to be long overdue for fire, suggesting open forest biodiversity is likely to be in decline on all sites. Despite this threat, fire had not been restored to any sites, and due to restoration works exacerbating canopy closure and ground layer elimination, ecological burns are no longer feasible on most sites. So in summary, the gold band represents reference open forest conditions with an open canopy, dense ground layer and regular fire. When we first turn up to most degraded sites, the canopy is starting to close, the ground layer is being shaded out and fire is overdue. Our restoration efforts should be restoring open forest back to reference conditions. But what we found is that current approaches are pushing these forests further away from reference conditions towards closed forest. Moving forward, restoration targets should be based on appropriate reference sites where regular fire still occurs. Restoration of historical fire regimes is crucial for success. Koala planting should be at least at 8 metre spacings and rainforest plants should not be used. A dense ground layer should be recognised as a key indicator of open forest health, and we urgently need industry education and training to raise awareness of the threats of fire exclusion and canopy closure to open forest, and also increase knowledge of appropriate restoration solutions.
Thanks, Andy. You give us lots to think about as we put our sights on a trajectory for recovery. That brings to conclusion the set of 3 that we're listening to. Now it's time for Q&A. Just before we go there, we'll put another poll up. And I did notice as we concluded the first poll that 82% of you were optimistic, if you like, but understandably 17% of you were unsure about the future of koalas. So our next poll is a simple one. Have you planted a koala food tree this year? And while you're answering that, I'll start to look to the questions, and if presenters from this session can open their mics and turn on cameras. I think the first question actually would be interesting to hear it addressed from each of the three of you. It starts with you, Justin. When you talk about close tree spacing to reduce weeds, how far apart in metres would you plant koala food trees?
Yeah, so we, for our plantations, plant anywhere from 2.5 metres by 4 metres spacing to a 3 by 4 metre spacing. And we do that because we know that we'll get crown canopy closure. This is on open ground too. This is in, in paddocks and grass sites. And we know we'll get crown closure within a year or two, which means then we don't have to worry about weed control. We know from the work that was done over the years that natural regeneration in forests with eucalypts, Alex Floyd did a lot of this work. The stocking can be anywhere up to 10,000 seedlings per hectare as a result of that. So it's sort of the way the natural ecology works in the forest.
Yeah, you can observe it, can't you, in a paddock that's recovering? It's often very dense. I know it's not the same concept you're talking about, Andy, but do you have a view on starting densities with eucalypt planting in open ground?
I do think that we always need to keep an eye on whether we're maintaining the function in the long term. And so, yes, there is that phenomena of the plants sort of self-thinning over time, but what they'll do is they'll self-thin because they're at maximum canopy density that site can support. So they probably won't self-thin back to reference ecosystems even over time. So the other thing that's sort of, emerging more and more is that fire is one of the main agents that actually regulates tree cover in these ecosystems. And even if you start with high seedling density rates, say after an initial fire, on an ecosystem or an area that has a regular fire, so that it's historical fire regime, what happens is you only get a handful of those seedlings actually leave that fire trap, so the area down low where they're affected by those fires, and make their way up into the canopy. So you can get these huge flushes of seedlings after a fire, for example, but very few of them actually get up to create that shady effect on the understory. So I think that it serves well for managing weeds, but I think we're possibly running into trouble of creating the ecosystems in the long term that we desire.
Okay, thanks. And Rhonda, what does your experience teach you about densities in plantings?
Well, densities over time in a restoration project, I feel they're changing because we're learning all the time. And a lot of the sites, the two sites that I showed you are extremely degraded sites, old steep banana country, very different to a lot of the sites that Andy's worked on. We do a dense planting, probably now we'd be going 2.5 to 3 metres with trees. And this, as those other slides I showed you next to the regrowth forest, it's a lot of dense stems, but I'm hoping in time they probably will thin out a little. Maybe with fire, well, they probably certainly will, but none of our sites have had fire as yet. So I would still stick with that 2.5 to 3 metre plantings on any of these steep ground.
Okay, thanks. And there's a kind of question that leads on for you, Rhonda. How do you get shrubs, forbs, and native grasses, as would be found in a native open eucalypt-dominated forest, back into these plantings?
Well, it's not easy because you'll find that typically a site that has had fire will have grasses as their ground cover understory, whereas where it's not fire, you'll get more of a shrubby understory. I always hope that these plants will come in by natural regeneration. And as I said, one of the lower sites, we had really good natural regeneration, including probably at least, I'd imagine 10 or 12 different ground covers had come in naturally. So they would have been seeding from adjacent vegetation or brought in by other vectors. So I think, in time, I'm interested to see what does happen to those really degraded sites. And if you have a look at some of the forests on these sites, the naturally occurring forests, it's quite often there's quite a sparse understory in the younger forests. And yeah, I just think, again, it's that monitoring to see what does happen, because so many restoration sites, you get that natural regeneration and it all happens. It's not possible to plant, or I won't say it's not possible, but difficult to plant because most of these sites are very large.
Yes, and you just want to kickstart natural recovery.
Yeah, you just want to get it all moving and, get that function into your system.
Okay, thanks. Interesting question. We're talking a lot about planting koala food trees. What about weed control and reintroduction of appropriate fire regimes within existing habitat? Is there a focus on this within funding programs and planning for restoration? How much is being considered with the rollout of restoration programs currently planned? Who'd like to have a go at fire regimes in existing habitat?
Well, Justin, you could probably handle at least some aspects of funding within forestry.
Yeah, well, I think for us, it's more fire. Yeah, I guess it's not about funding for restoration. It's more about managing the landscape with fire, which is what we think is important. And, I think, after summer, it's just highlighted how important it is, that we need to try to make sure we're keeping the forest safe and healthy. I think personally, I think there's probably a transition if you're planting and restoring forests. And then at some point, and I think I talked about after, the age of 20, 30 years, you might want to start looking at reintroducing fire into those stands that are on cleared land I'm talking about there, and try then to start getting those natural processes working. And I think that would also help then in terms of your grasses and forbs and trying to get that ecosystem functioning that way.
I guess I'll just add something quickly if I can.
Sure.
It's a new space, obviously. We're really only just coming out, and largely still many of us are still sitting in that situation where we see fire as only problematic. But increasingly we're understanding the importance of it in sort of maintaining these ecosystems. And even though we've got a long road ahead of us and we're just taking baby steps into this arena of using fire as a restoration tool, I guess the thing that gives me hope is looking back at how the restoration industry was overall. It's only 20 to 30 years old, and back in the 90s when we were first talking about getting out there and paying people to pull out weeds in native ecosystems, most people thought you were absolutely crazy. Yet over time we've developed this really enormous and sophisticated industry, and so I can only hope that maybe in another 30 years time we might be in a similar place with fire use as a restoration tool.
Can I make a quick comment?
Sure.
I think that as far as funding for using natural regeneration, it's totally overlooked. Just have a look at funding that's happening now. It's all focused on planting. There's the money there, there's the push there. Let's get trees in the ground. Whereas really we should be, as a priority, restoring existing habitat and expanding on that habitat.
Yeah. And I think the question that is at the top of the list, but it sort of relates to what we've just talked about, would echo the same thing, that the investment is being made in re-veg, but should there be more of a focus on things such as fire management in existing habitats, and assisted regeneration? So
yes.
There you go. Well, I'll take the question below that. Are we sustaining and creating koala habitat that was not there prior to European settlement, when much of the far north coast was rainforest and not open forest? Having grown up in the Brunswick Valley, there's been a loss of rainforest over the last 60 years. So is the increase of rainforest in the area wrong, if you like, problematic?
Yeah.
Is that your theme, Andy?
Yeah, it is. It is. So there is a bit of a prevailing belief that the big scrub is obviously an entity in our region up on the Krasnozem plateaus, extending from Bangalore down towards Clunes, say. But a lot of people think that the big scrub generally sort of extended right through, and that the Mullumbimby or the Brunswick floodplain was all rainforest as well. But if you have a look at the remnant stands of vegetation there and the remnant paddock trees, that's just not the case. And you can really quite easily interpret the landscape and identify wherever you have portions of the landscape that are protected from regular fire, peninsulas going out into rivers and southern facing slopes adjoining the Brunswick River, for example. You get patches of rainforest there because that fire frequency just isn't coming back there. I wouldn't say there's any situation where we're planting eucalypt forests on ex-rainforest land. There's no evidence of that except for in the big scrub, because it's in our area, it's one of the spots where we happen to have the best populations of koalas. That's there needs to be discussions around that, I guess. I think there's value in planting some up there to support those populations. But I think once you move off that big scrub Krasnozem plateau, the opposite is in fact true. And we're finding most of our open forests are actually in various stages of transitioning towards rainforest.
Okay. There's one more question we can squeeze in if I'm going to stick to time, and I think it's a good sort of technique thing. Could you please, Andy, suggest for the layperson how they work out what the reference community should be for their site when confronted with the grassy paddock in the Northern Rivers?
Very hard with the grassy paddock. I guess running through that, the first thing I'd do is try and find remnant paddock trees or just existing remnant trees as close as you can to your site, or find, if you're lucky enough, to find adjacent areas of remnant vegetation. The next step I find is then to identify what, if it's a eucalypt forest, which hopefully if you're planting koalas, your local area was that, that then you'd identify whether it was a dry open forest or a wet open forest. And even with remnant paddock trees, that can be done by the structure of the trees. If it has branching below halfway and the trunks are somewhat crooked or leaning, then it's a dry open forest. And then I think step 3, if usually your adjacent patch is in pretty poor condition as well. Around here usually hasn't had fire for 50 or 60 or more years. So then I would recommend, if you identify it, for example, as floodplain forest red gum swamp box forest, which was really the template throughout most of our floodplains in this region, then try and identify a patch of that vegetation that still gets fire at the regimes that we expect fire should occur in those. So national parks have those, there are regional guidelines. And if you can find a patch that is getting fire at the appropriate interval and hasn't suffered too many other degrading impacts, then that's what I would be looking at. And I think it's very important, because a lot of people do just go to their nearest patch, which is often riddled with its own management issues, and it's something that doesn't provide a good model. Okay, that's good advice. Thanks. I hope that answers that question. We unfortunately won't, as we want, get to answer each question. So to stay to time, we're actually going to begin session 3, the last 3 presentations, followed by another Q&A session, and then I'll give some advice about having lunch, which you may not need advice on, but more importantly, coming back from lunch to our discussion session after lunch. So the first presentation in our last batch of 3 looks at revegetation and climate adaptation.
Hi everyone, my name is Polly Mitchell. I'm the team leader for the Cultural and Ecosystem Adaptation Group in DPIE, and I'm going to be talking to you today about our Climate Ready Revegetation Program. The Climate Ready Revegetation Program is looking to try and increase the survivability of revegetation projects from the impacts of climate change, and it's really building on a really fantastic piece of work that was done by Nola Hancock, Rebecca Harris, Linda Broadhurst and Leslie Hughes, which is the Climate Ready Revegetation guideline you have here. The guideline was really, the impetus of the guideline was looking at trying to answer some of the questions from practitioners around how do you address climate change impacts in revegetation projects. And since then, our agency has been expanding that into implementation, where we're looking at supporting local land care groups and private landholders to pilot how they can start looking at different provenance strategies to build the survivability of revegetation in their re-veg projects. Now, Now, one of the, just move that down there, one of the Major aspects of the climate ready revegetation guideline was looking at using a different provenance strategy to be able to increase the likelihood of success or survivability of the species that you're planting in your revegetation project. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of different provenance strategies that are available to us, provenance being where things are from. So the idea is around where do you collect your seed from to plant in your reveg site. And we are promoting within the Climate Ready Revegetation Program a climate adjusted provenance strategy, which compared to the local strategy, so most of the previous work that's been done in reveg has been using a local provenance strategy where you source your seed from the area close to where you're going to plant your sites, because the theory is that it's the most adjusted or adapted to the area that you're planting in, which makes sense. But climate change is kind of throwing all of that out the window, where you're having a shift in climatic systems that are going to influence the ability for those species that are there to be able to survive in the future climate of those areas. So in contrast to that, the climate adjusted provenance strategy, which is the top one up here, is looking at sourcing seed across a distribution of climatic niches of the occurrence of that species. So most species have, or some species have, quite large distributions that sit across a whole suite of climatic niches. And you can, theoretically, you can choose your species provenance and collect seed from the local area, but you can also collect seed from populations that sit along that climatic niche to places where their current climate is projected to be, their current climate is what the site that you're planting in's projected climate is going to be. So they're already sitting in a, let's say, a hotter and drier ecosystem than what you're planting in, and you can source your seed from there with the theory of it being able to survive the future climatic changes. Now, how we do this is, this looks super technical, but it's, we're working out the process. But one of the research pieces that has been generated from Macquarie University, Rachel Gallagher, is called the New South Wales Ecological Niche Finder. And what that does is that it maps all of the species occurrences, floral species occurrences in the state to their current climatic niche, all the ecological data. And you can see here, this is an example of one of the outputs on this site. It's an online tool, which is super useful. And this shows you, the red and blue is just the state difference. Don't worry, it's government. It just shows you the occurrence data that you have within that niche finder of the species that you're looking at. And what you can do then is select different climatic variables like precipitation or mean temperature or hottest quarter, driest quarter sort of thing, and you can plot the occurrences of that species against that niche. Now, what we do in the government is we then plot the climate change projections from the New South Wales and ACT regional climate model against those occurrences to show the future climate of where those species are likely to be, of the place that you're going to be planting your revegetation project, what the future climate is likely to look like. And then what you can do is you can actually identify an area where those occurrences are currently sitting in that future climate, and you can source your seed from those populations to be able to test a climate adjusted provenance strategy. I'm more than happy to take questions after this. This is a lot of technical information, but we'll get through it. So this is an example where the site that you're planting is this orange dot here, which is a little hard to see. And this is a hottest quarter and driest quarter for Acacia decora. And we have a provenance selection process where we choose between the climate change projections and source all of those locations of occurrences of the species to try and choose a selection where we might be able to source seed in a hotter, drier environment of what's likely to look like with the projections of climate change. So you can see here the map to the side is all of those occurrences, and you can see there's a big spatial variation between them. As you can see, the little yellow dots are just examples of where you see where those occurrences sit within the spatial the spatial spread of the species, and you can see that it's a bit different when you look at the climatic niche of those species. Now, this is a very quick overview of what we're doing, but the whole idea is to have trials of this climate adjusted provenance, to be able to determine the ability for us to be able to build resilience into our landscape and build resilience into our habitat protection and restoration projects. We have quite a few groups that are working on this now. The first group that we worked on with is the Yass Area Network, but we're also working with Border Rangers, Richmond Border Rangers Land Care, Wagga Wagga, Narrandera and Albury, and there's other areas across the country that are looking at applying this type of process to their re-veg as well, such as Bush Heritage and other places in Victoria. Now, one of the really interesting things, especially for this group of koala people, is each of the different projects have a different objective to what they want to get out of their revegetation projects. And the Richmond group, their objective was around being able to plant climate adjusted foraging species for the koala. So, their species, they're using 5 species, 4 eucalyptus and 1 Alocasarina, and they've got 11 properties that they're planting on, which is really exciting. There's a whole bunch of work that's happening now around trying to build up the ability for us to be able to collect seed, which is a big challenge at the moment, but that's a whole nother conversation. I would highly recommend you get in contact with us. So my colleague Jo Wilson is really driving and leading this work, and I'm more than happy to have a chat with you as well if you want to get in contact with me. But this is a very quick overview of some of the work that's happening to try and build in climate change resilience into our revegetation projects, which is one of the most significant adaptation actions that we could do right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Polly. I feel like planting to be climate ready is an important and somewhat new dynamic for restoration projects to take into account. Thanks for bringing that to us. Now, Charles Marshall will give us a cultural perspective on species recovery.
Today I'll be introducing a new concept where threatened species and landscape management are based on applying Aboriginal ideology. It's a project that places Gumbaynggirr worldview as primacy in decision-making, planning, monitoring and the objectives. After 232 years of Western mindset in law, science and natural resource management, it has seen the immediate and continuing decline in ecosystem functions, habitat integrity and healthy country in general. A secondary but significant effect is the reduction of cultural keystone species. The Saving Our Species project allowed a new paradigm and a new tool to be explored, and where Gumbaynggirr ideology, through the Dungir Gagu storyline, has been applied in the foundational establishment of the planning process. This is representative of the amount of knowledge that's held within New South Wales and Australia. I could only fit 2,000 years on my screen, but it goes beyond to 80 and 120,000 years. Down in the corner is where colonisation comes in and Western science and ideology. In shifting that paradigm, you can see that Indigenous knowledge is only a slither, and with that much information behind us, it should be used. It may not be called science, but Indigenous knowledge refers to the ideology and the knowledge that Aboriginal people have, and since the beginning of time have used to discover new ways and how things exist and move in the natural environment. It embodies a process of ecocentric perspective and knowledge systems of environmental indicators and familiarities. The Dadaroi Gumbaynggirr Dungir Jagun Manga Bayalam Good Gumbaynggirr Koala Country Plan. You might be asking, what's all these other species in the ocean got to do with koalas? Well, it has a lot. So in our storyline, it's a creation story about the Dungir Gagus, the Koala brothers, and it tells of rising sea levels and the fact that the Koala brothers use their long intestines to save the people that were trapped out to sea. Woven within this story is the cultural protocol and law that guides Gumbaynggirr engagement in threatened species conservation and forms the framework for the management plan and monitoring. That's essentially the tool. The data that got out of it was the traditional seasonal and species knowledge specific to fire management, species monitoring and management, and local knowledge on country. So the koala story basically looked at cultural keystone species within the koala story and the cultural indicators within there as well. It then came down to the coastal zone and the coastal habitats within there. We then developed a koala story calendar, which included all the species that are involved in the koala story, the quolls, the owls, the sharks, the whales, and then a fire calendar, which is specific to managing fire on country, specific for koalas, and then a monitoring calendar, which is then used, has species indicators that are used in monitoring the health and well-being of that country. The observational component of it included presence and absence, behaviour, seasonal cycles, patterns, and then species interactions. Okay, so this is what the calendars look like. Got presence and absence of species. It looks at the behaviour during their ecological cycles and the seasonal cycles, any patterns that are within those species interactions, and then that biological and ecological functioning of each species. It includes marine and terrestrial species that are interwoven and give a holistic picture of what's happening on the landscape. And there's one specifically for the koala, one specifically for fire management, and then one for monitoring. The monitoring techniques basically show seasonal variability. So when used, they give a baseline information, and we're able to have a look at what's happening in short timescales. We're able to look at temperatures and seasonal and daily changes. We're then able to look at the related cyclic changes, and it's a visual pattern of the variables over these periods of time. After then some years, we're able to then have a look at what's happening with climate and the long time scales and these visual patterns of variations over these periods of time. There's a need for this because it gives a baseline picture of the bioclimatic analysis. It's predicting and adapting to weather patterns and tides. It gives a picture of local species and landscape features and the diversity that's in it. It shows interaction among species, including the food webs, the stages of ecological succession following disturbance like fire, flood. It also gives a picture of migration patterns and the variance and vagrancy that happens within. It also is based on the floristics of plants, and then it shows and can show seasonal variation and productivity in those habitats. It also then gives a picture of behaviours and life cycles, those migration routes, population fluctuations, and then the local habitats of different species and the health. Things that worked well for us was that it's a new ideology and it's a new framework for including traditional ecological knowledge in threatened species recovery and management. It's a holistic landscape perspective based on species management and Aboriginal ideology. It provides a monitoring and evaluation based on traditional cultural mechanisms. The secondary outcomes were implementation of Aboriginal language, intergenerational knowledge transfer, and knowledge exchange and sharing, and Aboriginal empowerment. Things that we could change is that the multi-year funding to ensure momentum and capability of assessment and monitoring in those techniques. Also, an assessment of the benefit of the multi-government participation and their alignment, capability and capacity to support and implement the plan with us. A two-part process to the project, one being the community and two being the government engagement and consultation. And then obviously greater consultation with community based on language group boundaries or bioregions rather than just local land councils or LGA boundaries. Future recommendations is designing an approach for the future, which revolves around equity and acknowledgement and management, diversity in tools and methods, removing monocultures out of our management, policies and procedures change for the benefit of country and our cultural practices, getting back to traditional mechanisms and managing our traditional country how it was, and applying management and governance principles to how this all was managed prior to invasion and Western colonisation. Closing comments is that the decisions we make today about our national identity, our cultural ideology, our resource management and our landscape health, which includes water, agriculture, biodiversity, will have lasting consequences for our children and future generations. By considering future climate when making these decisions, Australia will be in a better position to deal with the unavoidable impacts of climate changes. By incorporating these various options on Indigenous knowledge, with our coping strategies, our traditional technologies, our social networks, together we can render communities resilient in the face of change. Let nature be your guide and your teacher. Thank you.
Thanks, Chills. You demonstrate well the depth of conservation knowledge in Aboriginal culture and the importance of us factoring that in. Our final presentation is about fine-tuning planting for pollinators.
My name is Peggy Eby. I'm a behavioural ecologist with a long-term interest in the conservation and management of flying foxes in southeastern Australia. Hundreds of people have contributed to my work over the years, some of whom are participating in this webinar, and I'd like to acknowledge their valuable contributions. I'm currently involved in a transdisciplinary study of hendra here in Australian subtropics, and our primary hypothesis is that the loss of critical winter feeding habitat for flying foxes alters their roosting and feeding behaviours in ways that increase the risk of transmission of the virus from bats to horses and then to humans. One of my tasks in the work is to assess the capacity for existing and planned habitat restoration and regeneration projects to enhance winter feeding habitat for flying foxes, and therefore my involvement in this webinar. There are broader conservation issues here. Loss of winter habitat is also the primary threat facing grey-headed flying foxes and other threatened nomadic nectar-dependent fauna, regent honeyeaters with parrots, little lorikeets, and others. There's considerable overlap in the habitat requirements of koalas and the winter habitat requirements of these threatened species. And my aim in this talk is to encourage those planting and regenerating habitat for koalas to consider the needs of threatened nectar-dependent birds and bats in their projects. I'm going to begin by explaining why it's important to conserve these animals. As I've explained, my expertise is with flying foxes, so I'll rely on that knowledge in the talk, but I want to emphasize that the principles also apply to threatened bird species. So why are these animals important? Because of the roles they play in maintaining functional vegetation communities, particularly their pollination services. They have a diverse blossom diet comprising about a quarter of the eucalypts in their range, and they're adapted to moving pollen long distances. They lick nectar out of flower cups, and it's a messy affair. In the process, their fur, particularly the fur on their heads, comes into contact with anthers and stamen of other flowers, providing a pathway for both collecting and depositing pollen. The hair on their heads have fine combs structures that collect and hold pollen during flight. We catch animals as they return to roost in the morning. When they're feeding on blossom, they arrive with their heads covered in cream-colored pollen, which you can see here on the image to the right. We're using GPS trackers to document the feeding movements of flying foxes. This is one night's feeding fixes from a single animal roosting in Rotary Park in Lismore in August 2018. It flew south to Bungawalbin, where the forest red gum and grey ironbark were flowering heavily, and it used 8 feeding areas during the night. Those are the yellow dots. Each of the feeding areas contained multiple closely positioned trees. It fed on forest red gum in its southernmost feeding area and continued to use that species on its way back to Lismore, first stopping in trees lining on the Wilson River, and then a small remnant on Skyland Road. The longest distance between the feeding areas the animals visited was 44 kilometres, and it transported pollen from the large reserve to isolated remnants. This single night's movement of one of the approximately 90,000 flying foxes that roosted in Rotary Park during July and August of 2018 is a prime example of the diversity of the pollen transportation role they play. It's impossible for me to comprehend the extent and complexity of pollen transfer that took place in those months. Flying foxes move pollen further distances during migration flight, and this is the feeding pattern of an animal as it migrated from Harvey Bay to Noosaville, feeding on Melaleuca quinquenerbia along its way. Its first and last feeding areas were 86 kilometres apart. The flowerings we monitored in winter 2018 also attracted swift parrots, little lorikeets, regent honeyeaters, black-chinned honeyeaters. All of them were sighted in the same areas as our flying foxes. The irregular flowering patterns of eucalypts means that individual patches may only be productive once every few years. However, nectar-dependent birds and bats are remarkably adept at tracking these resources over hundreds of kilometres. They don't use regular to and fro migrations. They can't. They must be nomadic. This map shows the collective movements of 100 grey-headed flying foxes captured in the Sydney Botanic Gardens in May of 2012. It's from a satellite telemetry study. Most of the devices lasted fewer than 12 months. A couple functioned for 4 years. But the diversity of movements is the most obvious point. Individual animals provide pollination services to a wide range of diet plants distributed over expansive areas in a relatively short period of time. They link apparently unrelated vegetation communities into a large, spatially complex network connected by shared pollinators. It's a network built on interdependencies, a very different way of imagining habitat connectivity and well worth conserving. Nomadic animals are challenging to conserve. It's difficult to identify critical habitat. However, nectar-dependent birds and bats in Southeast Australia generally experience winter food bottlenecks. 2018 was exceptional. Only 5 of the 59 diet plants in their blossom diet are reliably productive during winter. This map shows a distribution of vegetation communities that contain those species within the bounds of the range of grey-headed flying foxes. They occur in land valued by humans that is poorly reserved, has been heavily cleared for agriculture and development, and is exposed to ongoing incremental loss. A sobering example occurs in the Tweed Valley. The slopes of the Gondwana World Heritage Area provide food during the warmer months, highly protected habitat. But the heavily cleared, privately owned floodplain once provided winter food. That's where the winter food occurred. This is the primary threat to all nectar-dependent birds and bats in southeastern Australia. That's the bad news. But the good news is that 4 of the 5 critical winter diet species are also koala food plants, presenting an opportunity for this group of threatened animals to benefit from this moment in time when significant resources are being put to restoring and regenerating habitat for koalas. This is the list of critical plants for nectar-dependent birds and bats, showing their rankings as koala food plants in northeastern New South Wales. Forest red gum and swamp mahogany are ranked highly as preferred diet food trees. Grey ironbark is ranked as significant use, and broadleaf paperbark as irregular use. Reference communities for koala plantings offer a range of options for species selection, and I encourage those involved in this work to take into consideration the needs of threatened nectar-dependent birds and bats when developing your species lists. The benefits go beyond conservation outcomes. By attracting nomadic, long-distance pollinators, you build genetic diversity and resilience into your plantings and embed your local project, no matter how small, in ecological processes that play out over large spatial scales across southeastern Australia. Finally, I encourage you to include in your monitoring programs and measures of success, not only survival and growth of your plantings, but also reproduction, flowering, particularly that attractive to pollinators. I'd be happy to discuss these concepts further. Please be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peggy. I get the feeling that this group of practitioners is thinking ecosystems and habitat connectivity, but your presentation makes it very compelling to do so. So thanks for that. I think we have a third poll to display just before we move into the last Q&A round. So do submit into that poll, and any more questions, especially for the panelists who just gave those 3 presentations. Okay, I have some questions in the list and you have been voting on them, and so I'll go to those. Some of them are obviously spanning the whole stimulus we've had from all 10. Any panelist can open up to answer this one. I'm keen to know more about how we promote cultural burning across tenures to promote koala habitat restoration. What are the key barriers for RFS or other regulators to cultural burning? This maybe links back to Andy Baker's comment about the ideal fire frequency to maintain open woodland habitat. So the core of that question is about how do we enable cultural burning across tenures?
Richard, I think Chelsea's the best to answer that question, or at least start to answer that question.
Thanks, Billy.
No worries.
Look, it was something that we discussed in putting together this koala strategy the other day. Look, the issue that was brought up about the legislation, so obviously the use of fire in legislation is one of the key issues. So at the moment, you have those three primary fire agencies, national parks, RFS and state forests, that all conduct fire management under their own regime until it gets to like a section 44, and then it becomes a collective issue. So one of the issues, and the primary issue, is those standard operational procedures, the policies associated, and then how you then start to implement cultural burning practices in these government state-owned areas. And I know that National Parks has developed a program and a component of trying to look at how cultural burning practices can be integrated in. But at the moment, there's still a lot of questions around how it works, how it operates, and who gets to control the functionality of how it rolls out, basically, and what actions and the practice on the ground, what happens as well. So you're essentially, it's two world views of how to manage fire. And the other thing is that those agencies, their primary objective is life and property, which is cool, which is fine. But for cultural burning and for our realm, it's primarily about the species and about how we keep country healthy and sustainable. So those two ideologies also come into some of the issues as well.
Okay, thank you. Peggy, many of rainforest species in the big scrub fruited in winter. How important is rainforest fruit to flying fox diet in conjunction with the nectar and pollen in eucalypts in the area?
Question, Wendy. Yes, they feed on 51 species, well, that we know of, 51 species of rainforest fruits in the area.
Peggy, can you just get a little closer to your mic?
Can you hear me now?
It's faint, but we can hear you, yep.
Okay, it's up to the full level, so sorry, I can't fix that.
No, that's okay. Continue, thanks.
Okay, so there are 51 species of fleshy fruits in the rainforest that they feed on. Most of them fruit during the warmer months. There are a handful that fruit during winter, and they include the figs. But figs are not as productive in winter as they are in warmer months. So our understanding is that rainforest fruits are not a significant portion of their diet during winter.
Okay. I'll just take this kind of related question. Where can we access the list of winter flowering species that are critical for grey-headed flying fox?
Okay. Well, there are a couple of ways. First of all, you can contact me directly, but SOS supported a project where I documented, where I sort of did a review of the needs of pollinators and focused on these winter habitat bottlenecks. And it's available on the web, although I don't have the website to hand. Mike Roach might be able to help with that. But it's called Using Habitat Restoration to Conserve Pollinators.
Okay, thanks. We'll include that kind of information, if we can, in the write-up of the session. Peggy, a lot of questions to you. How do the recommendations in your guide on habitat restoration for long-distance pollinators compare with recommendations for restoring koala habitat? Are they essentially the same, or are there critical differences?
Again, going back to the winter food trees, there are a handful of winter food trees that are very important to the nomadic long-distance pollinators that are not used by koalas. So the list in the guides, the recommendations, and here I think Mike is referring to the document I just spoke about. They're slightly different. but there's considerable overlap, yes.
Okay, here's a question. Including some genes from future climate areas in koala plantings is a fascinating possibility. However, given that genetic diversity is the main mechanism by which extant populations in the area will adapt to climate change, are we doing enough to ensure genetic diversity for the collection of seed for koala habitat revegetation, or are we relying on pollinators to do that post-planting? Is that for you, Polly?
Yeah, I think so. Excellent question. One of the things that we're looking at with the Climate Ready Re-Veg is the use of those climatic niches as a proxy for genetic diversity, but it's not necessarily the case. There is a researcher in the gardens called Maurizio Rossetto, who a lot of you probably are aware of, where he's looking at trying to plot the genetic diversity of species and look at where gene flow is happening, which would then be your local provenance compared to the full diversity of the distribution. And that is going to try and inform a lot of the revegetation work that's happening in the future. There's a lot of research happening around that as well. So there's a project that's being funded by the Environmental Trust called Healthy Seeds that's looking at trying to have an industry-wide approach to maximising genetic diversity. But it is still a growing space.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at the time and realising that we, to stick to time, we probably have finished with Q&A for now. Questions were answered at times with written answers from panellists, I noticed, and so they sort of disappeared from my list to ask them in public. I hope that was a satisfactory way to sort of drill in a little bit on some of the content across those 10 fascinating presentations. I wanted to just spend a moment before we break for lunch describing what happens next. I think we're going to post into the chat for this session a link to the second session. It also came out in emails you received confirming your attendance. It's different to the one we've just been through in that this was a webinar a little more designed as a kind of one-to-many kind of broadcast situation. After lunch, we're coming back into a Zoom meeting and we'll be sending participants out to small breakout groups of 5 people with some questions for you to discuss. So a much more interactive session where you get to draw upon everything we've heard this morning and your own experience to address a couple of key questions. It's open to all, but of course it's not compulsory to attend. So we're going to leave the webinar open just so that you can come back and we'll reconvene here. We'll reconvene at 1:30. We'll be here from a bit before that, and that will enable you to find the resources you need, the link and other things to go across into that second session. Then in that second session, we'll have a quick chat about the way we're going to run it, and before long, you'll be sent off into small virtual breakout rooms, it's called in Zoom, and you'll spend some time meeting some people that are working like you on habitat restoration and discussing some questions. The questions will be available to you at a Google Drive so that you can download that document, look at the questions and even provide your answers into a Word document ready for submitting back to Billy, in this case, Billy Roberts. The session is really designed for you to develop a collective view on a few key points that will increase coordination of restoration. So you are welcome now to take a break. 2 hours is quite a long webinar, but I feel like that's been really high value. And come back to this session to obtain the links and to head off to the next session. So see you here just a little bit before 1:30. You have now 27 minutes, if you like, to go and grab a cup of tea, something to eat, and we'll see you back here then. I'll just check the chat pod before I leave to make sure I haven't missed something. No, I think we're good to go. So we'll come back to this session leave it open if you like, and come back at at 1:30 for to leave to the new meeting. Thanks everyone. Thanks presenters especially, and thanks to the organising committee for putting this together.